Do you have a sweatshirt that needs a bit of a makeover? I chose to upcycle this sweatshirt using some patchwork panels that I made, and it's much easier than you think. I'll walk you through all 8 steps that I went through to create a brand new sweatshirt. Step 1 is going to be super easy. You're going to want to pick your sweater, and then you're going to want to plan where you want your quilt accents to be. Now, when you pick your sweater, you're going to want a material that doesn't unravel. So you don't want a knit sweater or anything like that. And then when you plan out where you want your segments to be, it may not be as easy as it is on this sweater because I'm just going to replace this panel here and the arms where the white fabric is. So it's going to be pretty easy for me. It's already blocked out for me. Step 2, gather your fabric choices. You can have as many different fabrics as you want, as many colors and print styles as you want, and then you're going to cut them down to the size you want. I chose to do 2-inch squares. You could do rectangles, you could do whatever you want for yours that you're comfortable sewing. Step 3 is to sew the patchwork segments that are large enough to fit the panel sections we are replacing in the sweater. So I'm just going to place 2 squares right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam. And for my first row, I'm going to press all my seams to the left. I'm going to keep building this row until it's long enough to fill one of the segments on my sweater. My first row of squares is long enough to cover this segment I'm replacing on my sweater. Now I just need to sew a few more rows to get it wide enough to replace this segment. I have started on my second row and I am pressing all these seams to the right. I'm going to keep sewing the second row until it's long enough to match the first row. I have row 1 and row 2 pressed and they are the same length now. So now it's time to sew them together. Now remember, I pressed row 1 to the left and row 2 to the right. So now these seams are going to nest together perfect, and it's really going to help me sew this patchwork together so that these seams line up really nice and it makes it really easy to quilt later. So there's a lot less bulk here at these intersections because that fabric is pressed one way and the next row is pressed the other way. So I'm just going to put a pin in here to help hold it in place as I sew. Sew the rows together. Don't sew over your pins, remove them as you get to them. The first 2 rows are sewn together and pressed. I need to work on a few more rows to make this panel wide enough to replace the panel I'm removing on the sweater. So I've started on row 3. Now, because my row 2 is pressed to the right, I'm going to press my row 3 in the opposite direction, which is to the left. And as I build my rows, I'm going to note what the row before it, what direction it is pressed, and I'm always going to press my next row in the opposite direction so those seams can nest and I'll reduce my bulk in my panel. So I'm going to keep completing all of my segments in the same manner that I'm going to need to replace the segments on my sweater. All right, so I got 4 patchwork panels made for my sweatshirt that I am upcycling. And these are 3 that I already have quilted. I put a backing on them and I put some batting between the layers just so that the quilting could stand out a little bit more. So I have 3 completely quilted. So step 4 for the sweatshirt is getting the panel basted if you want to, and then quilting it. So I'm saying basting it if you want to, is because if you just want to do the panel and use that, you could. I think that would be fine. I just really want to get it quilted and stand out more like patchwork would. So for the quilting, you probably saw on one of my panels that is finished with the quilting that I went along each side of every single seam on here. So I sewed a 1/4 inch away from every single seam in both directions. So that is what I'm going to do on this final panel. So I'm just going to continue to fill this all with quilting. I think step 5 is probably the serious step because that's when we're going to break down the sweatshirt. So we need to cut out the segment that we want to replace with the quilting. And you want to do this carefully because you will want to use the part that you cut out as a template for your patchwork. So if you have a lot of patience, you could seam rip the stitches. I don't have a lot of patience, so I'm just going to cut out the section. So I'm going to start with the largest section first, so why not just go in? So I'm going to make a little snip, and then I'm just going to start cutting out. I'm going to, even though I don't want to take the time to rip all these seams, I am going to try to cut as carefully as I can. The nice thing is that since this was a sweatshirt my son first owned and then he grew out of wanting to wear it, my daughter took it over and she wore it for a while, then decided she wanted to donate it. And when I saw it in her donation pile, I thought this would be the perfect sweatshirt to upcycle. So if I do mess it up, it's not that big of a deal because it got a lot of use out of it. All right, so I'm gonna carefully cut up this seam here, right down the seam. Okay, and then I'm going to keep following the seams here. I'm going to keep cutting out each of these segments. So I need to cut out the back panel and each of the arm sections. Step 6, we're going to use the sections we cut out of the sweatshirt as templates to cut out our patchwork. So I pinned mine down and I'm just going to cut around it. If you want to, you can cut a little wider for seam allowance. It's up to you. Step 7, sew those patchwork panels that are trimmed down to size to the sweatshirt. I'm going to start by pinning it in place on the ends. And just as a note, I did seam rip and open up the seams here on the side a little bit so that I could sew this front panel in place. So I'm going to meet up the sides first. And then I'm going to just slowly pin, making sure to keep everything nice and even. Okay, so I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along here, and I'm going to make sure I don't sew through the other side of the sweatshirt. Now that my patchwork panel is stitched in place to the front, I am going to top stitch along each side of the seam just to match the patchwork. Again, make sure that the sweatshirt is pulled out of the way on the back. I'm going to follow those same steps to replace the back and the segments from the sleeves. Step 8 is to go through and check for loose threads. Make sure you caught all of your seams. There is nothing worse than gifting a sweatshirt or wearing your sweatshirt and figuring out that one of your seams wasn't sewn all the way through and needing to go back and fix it again later. A few tips I would like to give you when you are making your own sweatshirt is to pin a lot when you're bringing your segments together. I noticed that the sweatshirt stretches a lot more than the patchwork. So if you pin a lot, it will help hold everything together and not stretch out the sweatshirt material too much. Another thing I did is whenever I was sewing my sweatshirt pieces, to the patchwork pieces is I tried to keep the sweatshirt material down against the feed dogs on my machine as much as possible because it will feed the material through a lot more evenly. Another tip I would like to give you now, the reason I chose this part of this sleeve to add an accent of patchwork on is because it was already the same white material matching here. However, if you're using a different sweatshirt and want to add an accent on the sleeve, I would highly recommend measuring out an area farther down on the sleeve, maybe starting here at the edge and coming down a little bit. It will make things a lot easier for you. This was a lot of material meeting up right under the armpit. I had to pin and rip out seams a lot to make it work. I think it finally did, and when it's on, it's going to look great, but it was very, very tricky working in that area. Thank you so much for watching. I hope these steps and tips were helpful to you in making your own upcycled sweatshirt. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.